This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, preparing for rapid development and potential early attacks. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and unbalanced opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn and aims for counterplay on the queenside. This move develops a knight towards the center, preparing to castle kingside and control key central squares, which is a standard approach in many openings stemming from 1, e4 c5, often leading to Sicilian variations. This move solidifies black's central pawn presence and prepares to develop the dark-squared bishop, transposing into variations of the classical Sicilian defense. This move prepares to build a solid pawn center with d4, aiming for a symmetrical structure often seen in the Alpine Sicilian variation. Developing the bishop to d3 supports a potential d4 pawn advance, aiming to control the center and open lines for white's pieces. This move signals a commitment to the king's Indian defense structure, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal and challenge white's central control. This move repositions the bishop to a more passive square, suggesting a potential setup within the king's Indian attack or similar flexible systems. While preparing to castle kingside, this move correctly develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, preparing to castle and support the central pawn structure often seen in king's Indian defense setups. This move aggressively challenges black's central pawn structure, opening lines for white's pieces and aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's fianchettoed bishop. Castling is a crucial prophylactic move, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks, a standard defensive and developmental maneuver in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move prepares to control the g4 square, preventing the opponent's knight from jumping there and potentially disrupting white's kingside pawn structure or piece coordination. This move resolves the central tension, opening lines for both sides and preparing for the inevitable pawn structure decisions ahead. This move strategically opens the c-file for white's rook, creating an immediate central pawn presence and preparing for a flexible pawn structure. This move develops a knight to its most natural square, supporting the d6 pawn and preparing for further central control while keeping options open for a e5 pawn push. This move reinforces white's central pawn on d4 and prepares to develop the queenside knight, aiming for active piece play within the spirit of the Sicilian defense. Black boldly challenges the center, aiming to break open the position and create imbalances, a characteristic maneuver in certain lines of the Sicilian defense. This move initiates a closed center, restricting piece play for black's knight on c6 and preparing a kingside pawn advance for white. This move challenges white's central control and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This captures the knight, opening lines for the queen and bishop while clarifying the pawn structure in the center. Black recaptures on d4, opening the e-file for their rook and potentially challenging white's central pawn majority. This move reroutes the knight from the active d4 square to a more defensive square on e2, allowing the d-pawn to advance and creating flexibility for development while preparing to challenge black's central pawn on e5. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to contest the e-file and support potential pawn advances or tactical ideas in the center. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside and potentially expand on the kingside with g4, while also preventing black's knight from occupying the f4 outpost, but it does weaken the dark squares around the king. This move initiates a queenside attack, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the c2h7 diagonal and pressure white's d4 pawn. The bishop repositions to d3. A common square in this Sicilian dragon, accelerated dragon variation, aiming to support the pawn advance and potentially reroute to a more active diagonal, while also preparing to castle kingside if necessary. This knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing the potential pawn break at c5 and creating a defensive screen for the king. This move exerts pressure on the queenside and potentially prepares to challenge black's knight on d7. This move repositions the rook to the f-file, potentially supporting a future f5 pawn push to challenge white's central control and unblock the bishop on g7. Castling now secures the king, a crucial step as the central pawn tension is released and queenside pressure from black's rook and knight on d7 is anticipated. This move skillfully repositions the knight to a more active square, targeting the c5 outpost and potentially preparing to exploit the weak d4 pawn or transfer to a kingside attacking square. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting an advance on the kingside or preparing to challenge black's knight on c5. Developing the bishop to d7 prepares to challenge white's strong knight on e2 and potentially activate the queenside majority. This move provides essential kingside safety, preventing potential tactical threats along the g-file and freeing the g-pawn for future defensive or offensive purposes. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn structure by opening the f-file for potential piece activity and disrupting white's queenside coordination. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn push on f5 and potentially create threats on the kingside. This exchange of knights simplifies the position and removes a strong defender of white's kingside, potentially opening lines for black's attack. This move aims to regain the pawn on d4 and simplify the position, but it allows black to consolidate their strong knight outpost on d7 and potentially activate their queen. This move activates the bishop along the long diagonal and pressures white's queenside pawns, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially create weaknesses. This move is a concession of time and tempo, allowing black to consolidate their pieces and prepare for further central advances, particularly with their knights. This exchange simplifies the material, allowing black to potentially exploit the weakened light squares around white's king once the bishop is gone. The capture of the bishop on f1 opens the f-file for your rook and creates a passed d-pawn, offering white improved attacking chances despite the loss of material. This move breaks open the kingside pawn structure, creating immediate attacking chances for black's queen and knight while weakening white's king position. This move redeploys the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge black's control of the central squares and potentially prepare for kingside activity or to cover weaknesses on the queenside. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create attacking chances by opening lines against white's king, though it weakens black's own kingside structure in return. White retreats the queen, potentially preparing to regroup on the kingside and defend against black's advancing kingside pawn majority, while also avoiding the battery on the d-file. Black activates the rook to the open c-file, creating pressure and preparing to contest control of this important central file. This move prepares to contest the semi-open b-file, aiming to exploit black's potentially vulnerable queenside pawn structure while repositioning the rook for future action. This move aims to activate the queen on the queenside and potentially pressure white's d4 pawn, while also preparing to redeploy the knight. The move QB3 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square where it supports potential advances on the queenside and avoids further exchanges, while also potentially targeting weak pawns. This move sacrifices the queen to break open the kingside and create immediate attacking chances against white's exposed king. This sacrifice aims to disrupt black's pawn chain, open lines for white's pieces, and potentially create attacking chances on the king's side by weakening the structure around black's king. This pawn sacrifice opens the g-file, aiming to activate your rook and pressure white's king while disrupting their pawn structure. Capturing the b7 pawn initiates a dangerous pawn grab, but risks exposing the white queen to immediate counterplay from black's active pieces, potentially leading to a material imbalance or a loss of tempo. This move sacrifices a pawn to activate the queen and attack white's king, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create counterplay on the queenside. This move captures a pawn, but exposes the queen to potential threats and neglects the critical need to defend the now dangerous passed d-pawn. Black's move d2 initiates a critical pawn race to the promotion square, forcing white to decide between capturing the pawn or continuing with their own attack, as white's queen is currently overloaded defending against potential threats. This sacrifice is a desperate attempt to create complications and prevent black's passed pawn from advancing, but it ultimately fails to neutralize black's significant material advantage in attacking prospects. The recapture of the bishop with the king is necessary to avoid immediate material loss, but it opens the g-file towards the weakened king, creating significant defensive challenges for black. This move finally activates the rook on the e-file, contesting black's initiative and preparing to defend the vulnerable pawn structure while also considering potential counterplay. This pawn promotion to a queen is a forced move to capture the opponent's queen, fundamentally changing the material balance and opening up new tactical possibilities for white. With the opposing queen promoted and the game heading into a queenless endgame, white's king must be brought to safety by the king's current move to h2, avoiding potential checks and repositioning for defensive or offensive operations.